Well, hello, and welcome back to the Fat Doctor podcast. It's been a couple of weeks, and this is episode 21. I haven't decided what I'm going to call it yet, but I am ready to just talk a little bit about the pathologizing of fat. That's what I really want to focus on today. And it kind of came about because I was thinking, during the time that I was off, just took some time to think. Lay in bed and thought. And one of the things that I kept coming back to over and over again was the idea that we can have all of these kind of complex, nuanced conversations about fat, being fat, having fat, all that stuff. But the reality is that for most of us, we have a very childlike belief. We've been conditioned from such an early age about being fat, about what it means to be fat, that it's very childlike. And I kept coming back to this kind of phrase that just kept popping up, which is fat is bad. Such a simple and kind of almost childlike way to think about it. But I think deep down in most of us, there is a belief that fat is bad. And many of us have worked on this, and we are trying to challenge that belief, but it's still there deep down in the recesses of our mind, because that's what we were taught from when we were really, really little. Fat is bad, period, full stop. And therefore being fat is bad, because if fat is bad, then being fat is bad, and therefore becoming thin is good. Like I said, very kind of like childlike, very binary, very black and white, yes or no, good, bad. What is good? What is bad? We could have these conversations, but let's be honest, that's what we've been taught to believe. And there are lots of reasons why people think that fat is bad, and many of those reasons have nothing to do with health. But I am a doctor at heart, even though I'm not a doctor. Well, I'm not a practicing doctor anymore. Woohoo! But yes, those of you who don't know, I resigned my resigned my registration. I resigned my registration on, well, a little while back now. I can't think when this is going to be released, but yes, that's me getting carried away. That's me going off on a tangent. Let's come back to pathologizing fat. I have a little timeline. It's quite pretty, actually. And if you pop to my website, you will see that there is a blog that is very similar in nature to this podcast. It's almost like we're talking about the same thing, because I'm finally getting organized. And so you'll see a blog about the pathologization of fatness, or pathologizing fat. And you'll see a little timeline that I drew on Canva. I'm quite proud of. It's pretty. And you can take a look at it. But obviously this is a podcast, so I'm just going to describe it to you. Not the picture, what it says. I'm going to describe what it says. So I've done a little timeline about how we began to pathologize fat. And if you haven't already read Fearing the Black Body by Sabrina Strings, and if you haven't already read Belly of the Beast by Deshaun Harrison, then I suggest you do, because these two books comprehensively cover the very many reasons why we as society have been conditioned to believe that fat is bad. I'm not going to do that, because they do an amazing job at that. So you need to read those books. And if you haven't read those books, then I strongly recommend you do. I'm going to be focusing particularly on how the medical profession, by and large, pathologized fat, rather than talking about why fat is bad, why we have pathologized it, and therefore said fat is bad for your health. When did it all start? And most of us would argue that it started with eugenics. We've all heard, I imagine by now, of Adolf Quetelet. I probably said his name wrong, but Quetelet, he was I think he was Belgian. Was he Belgian? Oh gosh, I should know that. he was a eugenicist. He believed in the field of eugenics, and if you don't know what eugenics means, it basically is race science. It's about the betterment of the white race through scientific achievement, for want of a better word. That's really bad. Probably Google eugenics for a better definition. But anyway, he was a eugenicist, and he was well known by people like Sir Francis Galton and Carl Pearson, the kind of founding fathers of eugenics. Quetelet was responsible for, or helped create the what was it called? I've got it down here. Look, I'm looking for it. It's called the Positivist School of Criminology. Again, look that up. Pretty disgusting stuff. But he also theorised and publicised a paper and theorised that the average man, it was l'homme moyen, the average man, is characterised by certain ideals, and those ideals had to do with height and weight, amongst other things. And deviation from these ideals, which were the averages, right? So average was ideal, and anything that deviated was too large or too small was less than ideal, and therefore not as good. And he did his studies, as we probably all know, on a bunch of white European men, because everyone else was bad. So he wasn't interested in anyone else. He was only interested in white European men. And even amongst the white European men, some were better than others. And that had to do with basically their weight compared to their height. So that was Quetelet. Back in 1835, he published this paper. So quite a long time ago. And eugenics kept going for a long time after that. There's a chap called Dr. John Harvey Kellogg, and you will recognise the name Kellogg because I think his cousin is the founder of the breakfast cereals. He was definitely involved, John Harvey Kellogg, but I don't think that he's the founder of the actual breakfast cereal itself. But he was the founder of the Battle Creek Sanitarium, not sanatorium. And again, I would encourage you, if you've never heard of that, to look it up. It was a really interesting place. It's not all that different from a modern day kind of. Here in the UK, we have something called Champneys. It's like it's called a spa, but it's more like a fat camp, and they feed you like really gross rabbit food, and you can have like spa treatments, but also are encouraged to exercise regularly and become less fat. So he had the equivalent back in the 1890s. And he was a Seventh-day Adventist, and he was part of the temperance movement, and so he believed that food, alcohol, masturbation, anything like that was bad, very bad, and you needed to temper your desires and your lusts and your carnal needs, because anything other than that is sinful and was therefore bad for your health. And he was a doctor, so he took his religious beliefs and his eugenics beliefs and turned them into medical propaganda. Is that the right word? I don't know what else to call it, really. He genuinely believed that reforming the nation's women was one of the main ways to preserve, he was American, so this was all taking place in America, preserve the superior Anglo-Saxon race. So he published this book. I think he published a lot of books, but one of the books was called A Lady's Guide in Health and Disease. And that was all about, not being fat. Being fat was bad, and being thin and not eating and not eating meat or all sorts of other things. I'm not saying that he was a dick because he was a vegan or a vegetarian. I'm just saying that he was a dick, and he also didn't believe in eating meat. But he was part of the temperance movement, and he was also one of the people that was involved. In fact, I think he organised it, the first national conference on race betterment. That was in 1913, that conference. So again, we have this history of eugenics and race science, and religious sort of moral superiority and religious superiority and Christian. Well, I don't want to call it Christian necessarily, but there was this kind of puritanic. Well, no, that's probably not the right word. There was this movement sort of at the end of the 19th century where people really believed that to get close to God, you had to deny yourself food and alcohol and all sorts of other things, and somehow they connected that with being fat. So fat was all about greed and gluttony, and that made you a bad person and a sinful person. Talking about morality and Christianity, there was another doctor called Dr. Lulu Hunt Peters, and it's very difficult for me to say the name Hunt Peters without accidentally switching one of the consonants. And she was a doctor and a writer. I would have, my goodness, I would have hated her had I existed in the 1910s and 100 years ago or so. So she had this newspaper column called Diet and Health. And she wrote a best-selling book afterwards called Diet and Health with Key to the Calories. And she's the reason we talk about calories, folks. We can thank fucking Lulu Hunt Peters. I understand she was a fat child. She's talked about the fact that she was quite fat when she was a kid, and then wasn't fat. And she spent a lot of time talking about health and how your diet massively impact your health and counting calories. And she had all of these beliefs. So there were some religious beliefs, and also this was the time of the First World War. So there was this idea that, if you denied yourself food, you were doing something for your country, and you were being patriotic and you were helping with the war effort. So she brought in all sorts of crazy, I don't want to say crazy, that's a bad word, but really sort of slightly unhinged theories about why, you shouldn't be fat and you really shouldn't eat that much, because obviously one has everything to do with the other. And that, and if you counted the calories, you were a better person in so many different ways. So you can kind of see that, we started off with eugenics, and then we brought in some religion, and we brought in kind of like patriotism and white nationalism and all this other crap. And then we have the turn of the 20th century, and then along comes a chap called Lewis Israel Dublin. I don't know if he's a Louis or a Lewis, but I'm going to call him Lewis. It just makes it sound, I don't know, when I say Lewis, it sounds like I'm cross with him, which I am, because he was a bad man. He is supposed to be one of the kind of founders of modern kind of like, oh my gosh, what is the word I'm looking for? Oh, this is embarrassing. It'll come to me in a minute. Anyway, he worked for the Metropolitan Life Insurance Company his entire life that he worked for them. And he published, I think in 1930, The Money Value of a Man. Isn't that amazing? That you could just put a value on a person. Find out. I mean, like he worked out. He calculated it. He calculated it along with his team at the Metropolitan Life Insurance Company. They provided measures and dimensions for length of life and the outlook of future longevity. I'm just quoting from a paper here. Like he genuinely believed that he knew how long your life would be and how healthy you would be because of your dimensions, because he'd done some calculations. And okay, so he worked for a life insurance company, and okay, they were very keen on charging at higher premiums to people who had a poorer outlook. And one might argue that's a conflict of interest, but this was 1930 and no one gave a shit. Of course, no one gives a shit in 2024 either, so not much has changed there. So public health, there you are, came to me. He is considered one of the modern founders of public health. So he had an illustrious career working for the Metropolitan Life Insurance Company, but also being considered an expert in public health. So from the very beginning, public health and the private sector of, in this case, life insurance, were very much intertwined. And so yeah, like I said, conflict of interest. Speaking of Metropolitan Life Insurance Company, alongside Lewis Dublin and the team, they developed the standardised tables. So for a really long time, in fact, up until kind of mid-80s, we were using these tables, and they were the standardised tables. In 1942, they were published, the first set. These were for the quote-unquote ideal weight. So you measure a person's height, and then you look along, and you know it depends on their age and their gender, and then you'd find their ideal weight. And then I think was it 1959? Just looking at my notes. In 1959, they published the second set of tables. This was a desirable weight. So there was ideal, and then this was desirable. So we kind of moved one step out. And then I think in the 1980s, early 80s, it was just like height and weight. Forget ideal, forget desirable. It's just height and weight. So we use this in medicine. Like that, doctors, all healthcare professionals, for decades were using tables produced by the Metropolitan Life Insurance Company, by an insurance company, that they used to charge higher insurance premiums. And we, as doctors, adopted these tables and decided that they were correct. I mean, I don't know why we decided that they were correct. I don't know that there was really that much evidence. The only evidence provided, of course, was the evidence provided by Lewis Dublin and his team. So, but we just, it said these are the tables for ideal weight. And so we went, oh, good, that's what it is then. And so that's it. We adopted it. We did this for many years, and then along came a chap called Ansel Keys, who I always thought was a doctor, but he's not actually a doctor. He's a dick, though, and he hated fat people, really hated them. He was actually one of the people involved in the Minnesota semi-starvation experiment. So if you've heard about that, Ansel Keys was one of the key players there. Key players. I'm sorry, that wasn't intentional. And he really did not like fat people. He had a personal agenda. There's no question about this. And so in 1972, in the Journal of Chronic Diseases, he published a paper called Indices of Relative Weight and I'm sorry to use the word here, but obesity, that's what it was called. Indices of Relative Weight and Obesity. And that is when he introduced a term, the body mass index. And it was based on Quetelet's original theories about height and weight. And I can't remember the exact terms, I'm paraphrasing here, but he basically said, look, it's not particularly accurate, but it's as good as all of the others, so we're just going to use this. That's what he said. That's fine. It'll do. He made it very clear that it was for population studies only, because this was not accurate enough to use as an individual assessment. It simply wasn't good enough. The science wasn't there. But for population-based studies, it'll do. Those were his ringing words of endorsement. And I just want to point out, this was in 1972 he published this paper. In 1975, he published a book alongside his wife called How to Eat Well and Stay Well, the Mediterranean Way. So he's one of the first kind of like Mediterranean diet enthusiasts, even published a book about it. So he had his theories, and his theories were widely adopted by the medical community. That was in 1972. He published a book in 1985. So we're talking 13 years later. The Dietary Guidelines for Americans were published. I think it was the second publication. And what they did was they took the height and weight tables from the Metropolitan Life Insurance Company, and they essentially translated them into body mass index. So instead of using these complicated tables that were really, really difficult to use, they said, well, let's just use BMI instead. Even though Ansel Keys made it very clear, this is not supposed to be for individual assessment. This is meant to be for population studies only. Less than 15 years later, the dietary guidelines are like, fuck that, let's just use it. It's just simple, because it is easy. It's a very simple calculation. Those tables were bloody annoying. So 1985, the BMI was suddenly introduced as a means of assessing somebody's health, ideal weight. And at the time, it was ideal weight, right? That was what we were using it to calculate. 10 years after that, the WHO said, we are going to classify like different levels of BMI, and we're going to have cutoff points, and they are arbitrary cutoff points, 25, 30 and 40. They said at the time, and using arbitrary methods of association between BMI and mortality. arbitrary. They drew a graph and then they picked some numbers. It was very basic science, bad science, I would argue. So let's just refresh. 1972, Ansel Keys says, here's the BMI. It's not that great, but we'll use it for population studies. 1985, the Dietary Guidelines for Americans went, yeah, you know what, we will use it for individual assessments. And by 1995, the WHO said not only will we use it for individual assessments, but now we will use it to predict whether a person is healthy or not healthy. See how quick that was? Like, we're talking like 20 years. In 1999, the National Institute of Health, the NIH, followed suit, but went along with the Americans. Even though many, many people disagreed with this, there were a whole bunch of experts, even at the time, saying this is not a good idea. This is not good science. But they went, we don't care. We're going to do it. So they basically, millions of Americans literally overnight became either quote unquote overweight or quote unquote obese. Just because they decided arbitrary cutoff points, 25, 30, 40. That's it, done. I mean, let's be honest. What are the chances that they're actually those perfect numbers? Like, what are the chances that they're actual multiples of 5? Come on now, that's not realistic. This was very basic science. What if you're 24.9 versus 25.3? Come on now, like if you're 25.3, you're considered overweight, but if you're 24.9, you're considered normal. Come on, don't give me that. That's bullshit. So. That was 1999. I was in medical school by then, so it wasn't long ago at all. And so it's all gone downhill from there. We now use BMI to determine whether we believe a person is healthy or not. And this is problematic for 2 reasons. It's problematic for fat people because we lose access to certain types of healthcare thanks to BMI. We can't have life-changing treatments, surgery, etc., just because of BMI, just because they can, just because they can, and they do. But also, at the same time, if you're thin, people assume you're healthy. A third of people with a quote-unquote normal BMI are not cardiometabolically healthy. So they're walking around thinking, I'm fine. They're not. So it's problematic for everybody, and everybody should hate the BMI and want to scrap the BMI. But the BMI is still very much the number one method of assessing a person's health when it comes to weight. But there is no other. I mean, there are other options, but no one uses them. 2001, the PR team of the American Diabetes Association, an organization, I should point out, that is heavily funded by the pharmaceutical industry, in particular, obviously, the parts of the pharmaceutical industry that make diabetes drugs, because it's the American Diabetes Association. And so the PR team, and it was very much the PR team, decided that they wanted to, they created a term, pre-diabetes. It was very convenient. They suddenly made up this term, this condition that was like, pre-diabetes. There's diabetes and there's pre-diabetes. And that was very convenient because then all the people who sold diabetes drugs could start marketing their drugs to the pre-diabetes category. And in spite of there being numerous studies, even back in 2001 actually, but since then even more studies that show there's no such thing as pre-diabetes. It's not a thing, right? Like there is no condition that is pre-diabetes. In spite of that, it is still very much part of the lexicon, especially in the US and in the UK and some other countries. And it's there. We're still funding. We're still, as nations, we are spending a fortune on pre-diabetes. And who's benefiting from that? Let me think. Who could possibly be benefiting from it? Oh, that's right. Drug companies. In particular, a drug company called Novo Nordisk and another one called Eli Lilly. Oddly enough, they spend a fortune every year on the American Diabetes Association, but it's a symbiotic relationship because the American Diabetes Association is very keen on pushing weight loss. And those of you who are paying attention will know that Novo Nordisk and Eli Lilly have cornered the market when it comes to weight loss because they have created 3 very well-known drugs, Ozempic, Wegovy, and Mounjaro. So, yeah, were all these things related? I wouldn't want to speculate. In 2021, the FDA approves semaglutide, which is actually Wegovy, but everyone calls it Ozempic, as a weight loss drug, even without any long-term data to support its benefits and or risks. We don't know if it's going to help people in the long term because we don't have the data. But they approved it anyway, and they labelled it a miracle drug. And we are being told now, in very, very, very basic, simple terms, once again, fat is bad. Becoming thin is good. And good news, here's an injection. Take it and it will make you thin. And that will make you good. And in this case, it'll give you good health. But there is literally no evidence to support that whatsoever. It's just that we have pathologized fat to such a degree that we don't need to offer any evidence anymore. We don't need to prove that losing weight is actually going to benefit your health. Fat is bad. Fat is bad. Being fat is bad. And losing weight is good. End of discussion. We don't need to prove it. And then when we try to prove it, we fail every single time. There is not a single long-term study out there that looked at weight loss to see whether it had long-term health benefits and successfully proved that there was. Plenty of studies that proved there wasn't any long-term benefits. Plenty of them. There are no studies that prove that weight loss has long-term positive benefits on your health. None. Zero. Doesn't matter though. We don't need evidence because we have been conditioned since the beginning of the 19th century. We have been conditioned to believe that fat is bad. And so that makes people like myself who are saying, actually, why don't we just stop telling people to lose weight? Just stop it. Stop it. Like, why don't we just treat their health conditions without once bringing up their weight? That makes people like me, that allows people to label me as a quack, as a charlatan. I'm trying to think of all of the ones that I can say out loud. But I'm not. Because you see, it's kind of like all it takes is for someone to say, well, hang on a second. I'm not saying fat is good. But what if for 1 second we suspend reality and we just for a second say, but what if fat isn't bad? Just for a moment, let's just argue fat isn't bad. And therefore becoming thin isn't good. Just what would happen if that were the case? And then look at the data. Oh, hang on a minute. The data kind of supports that, doesn't it? That actually becoming thin isn't particularly good for you. I'm not saying it's bad for you, although I could argue that, weight cycling, etc., is very bad for you. But there's no evidence that it's good for you. And it's not like we haven't looked. We've looked. We've tried. We've spent decades sometimes doing studies to try and prove that, weight loss definitely helps. And people will come up with all sorts of excuses. Oh, well, it's because people don't try hard enough. Yeah, all right. Let's pretend for a moment that that's the case. I would argue that people trying to lose weight try very fucking hard because we know what's at stake. But let's say that's the case. If nobody can, literally nobody, or 2% of people or whatever, like the vast, vast, vast majority are not able to sustain weight loss, and even if they do, it's not helping their health. Can we agree, therefore, that it's not sustainable and therefore it's not worth talking about? Like even if you want to blame the fat person because that makes you feel better, can we still agree that it doesn't work? But no, that makes me a charlatan. It makes me a quack because we have been conditioned to believe, first and foremost, that fat is bad. And that, my friends, just it's almost impossible to challenge that deeply held belief. And I think if we're honest, if we look inside ourselves, we can probably find that deeply held belief within ourselves as well. Even if you are a fat liberationist and you work from a fat liberationist framework and you're all fat liberation here and fat liberation there and fat liberation everywhere, deep down, like that conditioning it's so primal and it happened at such a young age. we're still stuck in that kind of childlike belief, suspended in that childlike belief. And no matter how grown up we are and how many letters we have after our name and how long we've spent studying, science, that belief overrides everything else. It allows clinicians and researchers and public health professionals and everyone else to work under that assumption without ever being questioned. Like it is, sky is blue, gravity's a real thing, and fat is bad. It just is. And so even questioning that is the equivalent of questioning whether or not the sky is blue. Hey, and guess what? I live in Scotland. The sky is very rarely blue. It's almost always grey. But there we go. All right. Lecture over. I hope you found that helpful. Like I said, check out my blog. If you go to fatdoctor.co.uk, then you will find the latest, I think I've called it the latest, which is all my blog posts, and you can just check out this one and have a look at my pretty picture, and check out the other ones that I've written, because they're all very good, if I say so myself. And don't forget, you can watch these podcasts on YouTube if you want to, if you like watching videos rather than listening to podcasts. All right, I think that's it. Don't forget, you can book a consultation with me if you like the sound of things and you think, do you know what? I'd really love it if Asha was my doctor. I can be your doctor. I no longer work for the NHS. I no longer have a license to practice medicine in England, which means that I can work privately with anyone I want to. It's great. So you can hire me. Just go to my website, fatdoctor.co.uk, check out consultations and see if that's something that you'd like to do. All right, folks, thanks for listening and see you next week.